The moon of Muharram, times of sadness have come. The crescent has now arrived, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala. The moon of Muharram, times of sadness have come. The crescent has now arrived, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala. Betrayal by the Kufans set this moon on its course, calling out for their guide. Treachery with no remorse, Muslim and his sons. What a tragedy, oh what calamity. The moon bleeds to foresee, the moon bleeds to foresee. The moon of Muharram, times of sadness have come. The crescent has now arrived, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala. On the 9th it heard the prayers of those pure souls, fought the rising sun, for perhaps this could be its role. Akbar's azan so clear, this moon filled with fear. How will it possibly arise and see the state of those dear, and see the state of those dear? The moon of Muharram, times of sadness have come. The crescent has now arrived, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala. It saw the 6-month infant, no water but an arrow. That night it shone its light on Rabab, filled with such sorrow. To see my asghar I crave, I hear nothing but his cries. Oh son, please do not arise, and with this mother sympathize, and with this mother sympathize. The moon of Muharram, times of sadness have come. The crescent has now arrived, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala. Witnessed it the trampling on Sham-e Ghariba, saw that night the terror, bodies scattered afar, tents looted and on fire, earrings snatched from Ruqayyah. This moon also in such pains, this household bound in chains, this household bound in chains. The moon of Muharram, times of sadness have come. The crescent has now arrived, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala. From this month my Bibi had to wander veilless. Zahra's grave is restless. restless for her daughter princess, the cloak of purity. For this mother so holy, the beloved of Fatima, paraded in the bazaar, paraded in the bazaar. The moon of Muharram, times of sadness have come. The crescent has now arrived, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala, casting gloom on Karbala.
hopefully sound now.
पर मोहम्मद आले मोहम्मद बुलंदर सलवात की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए तड़पती रह गई माँ और अली अकबर नहीं आए मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए गुजर जाना ही लिखा है जवाब में अगर यारा गुजरने से अली अकबर के पहले माँ गुजर जाए मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए वही अंदाजा कर सकता है दर्द क़ल्ब लैला का नजर के सामने जिसके जवाबे तासना खाए मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए तड़पती रह गई माँ पर अली अकबर नहीं आए वो ज़ईफ़ी में पिसर की लाश उठाना एक कयामत है ये दिन अल्लाह दुनिया में किसी को भी न दिखलाए मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए, बस संभल कर खींचिएगा क़ल्ब अकबर से सिना मौला, उलझ कर नौके नेज़ा में जिगर बाहर ना जाए, मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए, उस ज़मीं थर्रा गई अकबर कला रख के रेती पर, हुसैन बिन अली जब शुक्र का सजदा बजा लाए, मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए, वो तड़पती रह गई माँ और अली अकबर नहीं आए, मुसीबत की घड़ी और शाम के बढ़ते हुए साए, पर मोहम्मद आली मोहम्मद बुलंद सलाम।
Thank you, Brother Mansoor. You really bring a spirit of Muharram to our gatherings. We really appreciate for all the years they've served us. MashaAllah. I request Said Kirmani for his address tonight. I will initially have my community announcements later on because we are short of time. I want to make sure we finish on time. We have enough time for Salaat. Said Kirmani.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أمر إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. حسبنا الله نعم المولى ونعم النصير. الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. وبعد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله نور السماوات والأرض صدق الله العظيم بين المجالس كل الصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman here in Seattle or across the globe, wherever you hear my voice, Assalamu alaikum. Question: what is the proof of the existence of God? We've been discussing the future of our community, and we've been saying that in terms of the light of the teachings of Abu Abdullah and what he learned from his grandfather and his father, we use the movement of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam to revive us, rebirth us, and give us a renaissance in every era and every time. Renaissance meaning a rebirth. And within that, we're trying to figure out what is the future of our community going to look like. And now, we may give some predictions about where it's going, but as you know, the future is very difficult to predict because there's so many moving parts and so many moving elements. But we can get some insight based on the experiences of others, which we'll highlight, inshallah, tomorrow. But tonight, I want to start this conversation about what it is that we need to start discussing and focusing on in our communities. Maybe in Muharram and Safar time, but maybe even outside of it. That is, we may need to, in addition to the majalis, not in place of, but in addition to the majalis that we have in the commemorations, also have a platform and a forum to have a dialogue, panel discussion with members of our community or guests that we invite from outside to try to discuss and tackle God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from a perspective of religion and theology, but also from a perspective of philosophy, but also from a perspective of science and other domains. Because you may find that on the issue of proving the existence of God, there's a lot of rich literature even that we can benefit from the Christian narrative, for example. We're aligned in this, trying to find one particular God. And we may find that we are actually closer to some Christians in this regard than even other Muslims. For example, as Muslims, Shia Muslims, we believe in a particular form of God. In fact, when I speak to many of my revert or convert friends, they actually say one of the main reasons why they came to Islam was because of Islam's concept of God, Islam's concept of Allah, which is different than the concept that they were taught in Christianity, for example, of God being Jesus and the Trinity and these types of things. So when they hear this notion of God, they are moved and say, this God makes sense, as opposed to a God with a physical being. But by the way, the God that we believe is not necessarily, we agree with this same God, all Muslims, up until the Day of Judgment. But some of our Muslim friends in Islam, they believe in a God that will have a physical form on the Day of Judgment. Meaning, and you can find these traditions, that on the Day of Judgment, within Muslim literature, you will find that certain Muslims believe that God will put his foot into the hell fire up to the ankle and he will cool off hell. And you'll find these, and many people, they try to justify these things. That's not our conception, our belief of God. We believe in a God that is not bound by time and space, the one who created time and space. And in that understanding and that realization, we are able to get closer to this Almighty. Why is this important? Why is it important to have this conversation? Because if you take the main theme of the Qur'an from cover to cover, it can perhaps be summed up into one word, and that is Tawheed. The Tawheed and the oneness and the monotheism of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And under that falls all the other themes, such as justice, such as righteousness, such as kindness, such as equality and equity, and all of these other terms that emerge. They can all be encapsulated in Tawheed. So it's very important for us to understand and reflect on this concept. Once this concept is established, then everything can be built upon it. But the dynamics of what you're finding in many of our communities, and by the way, it existed before. I was talking to some of our brothers here as well. In America and in the West in general, you'll find some of the best Muslims. Maybe you'll find some other not practicing ones, sure, right? But inshallah, Allah will guide them. Who are we to judge? But in that dynamic, you'll find some of the best Muslims. Why? Because many people are believing in it with dalil and istidlal and proof and evidence after having questioned. And despite that, they have a richer form of belief. And it's very important for us to appreciate that. Many people, they may have come from other parts of the world, Pakistan, India, Iran, Iraq, and they were never faced with these difficult questions, perhaps growing up there. But when they came here, these questions came to the forefront, and despite that, they were able to search, find these answers, and then get a richer form of religion and belief. So that's something that we should also appreciate. But when we start to tell people, read namaz, do fasting, do this, do that, what's happening is we're building the second, third, fourth layer of a building, but we haven't figured out the foundation. We haven't made the foundation strong. Whereas the foundation needs to be established. I'm not saying we don't do that. I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, and this is for young and old alike, when I was a child, my parents would tell me to do my math homework. At that time, I didn't really like it much, but now I thank them and I pray for them, and I'm so appreciative, because had I not done my math homework at that time, I probably wouldn't have been able to take the classes down the road that I was able to take. So sometimes you don't always know the wisdom, and it's important to implement things. Now, the Qur'an very clearly tells us why we should endeavor in, for example, prayer. For example, there's numerous verses that you can find on this. But for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "As-salat tanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkar." That this salah protects you and preserves you from these indecencies and the wrong path and these types of things. So now look at it. We're praying to Allah and we are reciting in Surah Fatiha, keep us on Salaat al-Mustaqim. That is the straight path. And Allah's telling you, I'm giving you a tool set that you can use on your path to Salaat al-Mustaqim. And that tool set, one of them is prayer. And so He's giving us this and He's telling us the game plan. And if we implement this, we're able to get a lot further. But if we don't, the problem and the reality becomes that what ends up happening is we first have to believe in the Qur'an, and we have to believe that the Qur'an is the word of God. And if we believe in that, then we'll be able to get to that point. You have to first convince and help the next generation understand God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the point that they are able to understand it, implement it in their lives, and then they will say that, I have to pray, I have to fast. That doesn't mean that we don't tell them to fast in between. It's a progress. You can never fully understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can never fully get there. You still, in the meantime, you still have to pray, you still have to fast, you still have to do everything in the meantime. But what we need to start in our communities is to make sure that we are trying to help understand the worldview of our next generation. Where are the gaps in terms of what they see and what we see? And how can we fill those gaps and address it? Therefore, tonight in our conversation, in the brief moments that we have together, I want to look at the proof of the existence of God. With respect to this, I want to look at how is this as fundamental in our belief system, number one. Number two, what was the whole movement and the message of the Qur'an? What was the message of Imam al-Hussein? Why did Imam Hussein alayhi salam rise? And what does this tell you and I about the message and the movement of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam? And what was its connection to God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What was Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam's indication in his words in Dua Arafah? And what indication does it give us about Imam's relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? At the fifth level, what are some philosophical arguments that can be strong arguments for the existence of God that are not even within the Islamic domain, but non-Muslims are using it? And what are those that some of them came from the Islamic world? What are those philosophical arguments? Number six, what is the element of the equation with respect to God and science? Is God concept compatible with science or not? Number seven, who was that atheist, the major atheist who changed his mind towards the end of his life? The number one atheist of the last 100 years. Who was he? What was his view at the end of his life with respect to God? Did he change his mind? And if he changed his mind, why did he change his mind? And finally, what was the view of God or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the minds of the people of Karbala, those people of Imam Hussein's camp, in particular his family, in particular his son who will commemorate tonight. This is our agenda for the brief moments that we have together. Wherever you are, here in Seattle or across the globe, from the bottom of your heart, send us salawat on Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. At the first level, if you look at the works of many writers, for example, Karen Armstrong, who's written many books. She was someone who was in nun school, and she eventually left that, and she went to Oxford, and she studied at Oxford, and eventually she became an author for writing about various religions of the world. I recommend you read her books. It gives you a lot of insight. One of the books that she's written, books on Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism and every major religion you can think of. But one book that I have that I invite you to read as well, it's called A History of God, 5,000 years. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And she goes through the whole belief in God from the Jewish perspective, into the Christian perspective, into the Muslim perspective, and what was that view, and what it is about the essence of the belief in God in all of these different faiths. And it gives you some very interesting perspective. So now what you realize is, when Islam came to that zaman and that makan and that time and space, was it for some triviality? This will solve some of your dilemmas. That is there, when Islam came to Arabia in the 6th century or the 7th century, at that point in time, was this something out of the blue, or was there a wisdom there? That is, why didn't Islam come to Indonesia in 2020, for example, like 2 years ago? Why didn't it come to Tehran in, for example, 1999? Why didn't it come to Seattle in 2022? Why didn't Islam come at this time? There is a wisdom as to why Islam came at that zaman and that makan, that time and that space. Why? That is because whenever Allah sends a divine religion, His divine religion, to a place, to a zaman and makan, that region has a particular significance. Now stay with me here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala realizes that the maturity of man has gotten to a certain level. And based on that, He would add the Sharia over time. And so when a religion of God, before Islam, Christianity in its time, before Christianity, Judaism in its time, and all the other Islam religions of God that came before Islam, as we said, there's one religion that's been coming since Adam to Khatam. Inna dina inda Allahin Islam. Verily, the way of life near Allah is Islam. But it has added Sharia and other elements over time. So what was it in those eras, in those times? When you look at the spectrum and you look at the paradigm, you begin to realize this pattern. And that is the people at that time, when it came to this belief in God, Rasulullah, they did not have a problem with Rasulullah saying, believe in Allah. Why? Because if you look at it, you will find that the Arabs, even before Islam, they believed in Allah. You may say, what do you mean? So if you look at Hinduism, for example, today, when Allama Tabatabai had studied Hinduism, he had an exchange with a French philosopher by the name of Henry Corbin, and they had letters back and forth. And he said that, what is your view on, for example, Hinduism? He said, when I studied Hinduism, Tabatabai's view, he says, in theory, Hinduism is a monotheistic religion. And if you ask many of the leaders and the religious scholars within Hinduism, they'll say yes. Because they believe in a high Lord, a high God, which the religions have, like Vishnu or whatever the name may be, and then other smaller gods. But there's ultimately one God. And they say it's manifestations. The example that they'll say is, you have 99 names of God. We just give a name or an image to each of those names. So it's the same concept. But he said that in the populace, Tabatabai says to Corbin, he says, but in the way it's practiced amongst the general population, they don't understand it the way that their scholars understand it. So it's gone into polytheism, the distinction there. So similarly, the Arabs before Islam, they had a high god by the name of Al-Ilah. Al-Ilah means the deity. Al-Ilah contracted and became Allah. So they didn't have a problem. They said, Muhammad, add another god to the Kaaba. We have no issue. We already have a bunch of gods. We already have 300 plus. One more won't hurt anything. In fact, it will be better for business. But he said, no. La ilaha. There is no God except God. That is what was the problem for them, because the idols were some element of their economy. There was nothing in Makkah at the time. The only thing that was helping the economy run was this pilgrimage that was happening. I don't know if you know, but people did Hajj before Islam. They used to come for that pilgrimage. There were people there who used to come. So that was the only reason people came to at the time. So they believed in Al-Ilah, but they also believed in these other gods. And that's what Islam came to say that no. You and us, we are all servants of one entity, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the key element. So when we look at this dynamic, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Islam, the reason that Islam came to that zaman and makan is this, that it was sent because whenever a religion of God comes to a particular time and space, it does one of three things to that area, that zaman and makan. It either absorbs, rejects, or transforms. Stay with me. Absorbs, rejects, transforms, meaning what? It either absorbs the culture, environment of that location, it either outright rejects or it transforms. Example, before Islam, the Arabs were already generous. They had generosity in their cultural environment. They were very generous. In fact, if you were seen as stingy in their environment, that was the worst insult before Islam. Islam said this is a good trait. Islam adopted this into the dynamics of the equation. Then Islam came forward and rejected certain things outright. What did Islam reject outright? Islam outright rejected caste system. Arab, non-Arab, none of that. That's rejection. Remember I said, the notion was Arab and Ajam, Arabi Ajami. Rasulullah said, no. It's on the basis of taqwa and piety. That's what matters. And so Islam rejected this class system. Unfortunately, after Rasulullah, the class system crept back into Islam. That's why Imam Ali rose and said this is not acceptable, because they started giving preferential treatment to certain people from certain backgrounds. Islam categorically rejected this. What is something that Islam transformed? If you ask scholars, they'll say one of the things that Islam transformed was the institution of marriage. Before Islam, there was no cap on how many women a man could marry. They would marry as many as they wanted, 20, 30, upwards. There's some really, these are children environment. There's some horror stories of family trees. Anyways, when you come to this, Islam said you can marry up to 4 if and only if you can do justice. Sometimes people forget the second part. I don't know why. That if and only if you can meet the justice, and justice is in all terms, social, economic, time, and I don't know how anyone would be able to do that. But in certain terms that maybe someone feels that they can, and eventually there. So Islam said, we're not allowing it to be unlimited, but we're also not saying that it has to be one, but in this environment, if you can do justice, then that is there. So the same way, Islam, if you look at the discussion of culture and religion, when we say in our communities, let's get rid of all the culture, what we're actually saying, and we may not realize it, is if you go deeper, we're actually saying, let's transfer this culture to another culture. And you may say, why is that? And the reason for that is because religion has never lived outside of culture, because human beings have never lived without culture. So whenever we practice something, there's a cultural element to it. It's like, for example, an aquarium. You may have aquariums at home. Aquarium has glass on all sides, right? That culture is the glass of the aquarium in which the body of religion and all of these things dwell. If you remove the glass, there's no aquarium. Everything floods out. So the question, Islam doesn't say that you need to wear this type of clothing, for example. Islam gives you a parameter that you need to make sure that your clothing is modest and it's not revealing and these types of things. But if you want to wear like a suit, that's up to you. And if it meets that condition, it's totally fine. You want to wear shawar kameez, that's totally fine. If it meets the conditions, if you want to wear a dishtasha or kanzu or thobe or whatever, you are welcome to do that. And so these things, you want to eat food, you want to have your biryani, you're welcome to have it. You want to have something else, you're welcome to have it, as long as it's halal and tahir and all of those things are met. So now when we say, let's get rid of all of the culture, what we're really saying is, well, we're moving to another culture, another dynamic. That's why when we discuss these things, we may come from a worldview that we had a certain type of experience. And I shared this with some brothers yesterday, but I thought it may be appropriate to share this as well. Because we're all on the same path. Our journey is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately. We follow the Ahlul Bayt because they hold our hand and take us to Allah. So this was happening on the East Coast. I was in a community lecturing, and the brother who was a relatively younger, he was the president. He says, Sayyid, you got to talk to these elders. I said, really? It was interesting because there was two age groups in between, right? So he was in the 40s age bracket, and he had grown up here his whole life. And he said that, like, we were having a day where we were cleaning the Zari room, like where some people from the subcontinent, they have alams and zaris and taziyas. And now sometimes people think this is bid'ah, but you have to realize the cultural environment from where this came. There's a poet who says a line, I'll translate it. I'm not justifying, I'm just trying to give you some perspective. We sometimes take our worldview and impose it on others. And the poet says, Roz roza-e sheh par kaise hazri hogi, hasrat-e ziyarat mein taziya bana dala. And the idea is that you can't, if you were in India at that time, you couldn't go to Ziyarat every single day. And so that wanting to be in the proximity of the Imam led an environment where you wanted to create the shabi or the replica of his zari, and so that you could pay your respects to the Imam. Now, over time, perhaps there were some elements of the Hindu belief that crept in maybe, and that may have had some influence. And there are scholars who have written on that, sure. But the intention may not have been negative in the beginning. The intention may have been very sincere. And so they were in this Zari room, and he says that we're cleaning up the Zari room, and the alam, the flag, has a stick that goes with it. And so one of the aunts or one of the elder ladies, she said, "Can you please pass me the stick?" And so I grabbed the stick and I gave it to her, and she got really upset. She said, "What? You disrespected it?" And I'm like, "Just a stick. What's wrong? Like, take it easy." And so he was telling me that they've become idolatrous. Like this is ridiculous. It's just a stick. Why is this person getting so upset? And so I said, hold on a second. In your mind, that was just a stick. In her mind, this was the stick of the alam of Hazrat Abbas. And that is not separated in her mind. In your mind, it may be separated. And this is an example I'm trying to share with you of the world dynamics. You may get upset at your child for not doing respect of the tazi or the alam or whatever, but what they see, what I see, what my grandfather saw when they saw an alam or a tazia, and what my grandson will see perhaps is two different worlds. And we need to understand that the way we grow up has an impact. If you came to America and you lived 18 and younger, 20 and younger, 24 and younger in another part of the world, you came with some luggage. And I'm not talking about the luggage you came on the airport with. You came with cultural, religious baggage. That is a worldview that was given to you by your environment. And your kids didn't necessarily get that worldview, and that's why it's so important to understand these things so that we can be very clear on them for our next generation. Now comes the issue. Why did Imam Hussein alayhi salam rise? And if you look at his writings, he says in his own statement on the way to, when he's leaving from Medina, he says, do you not see that Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi al Munkar is not upheld? Do you not see that righteousness is not upheld? Remember a few nights ago, I gave you the example that some of our brothers in Ahlul Sunnah are better than us about this. Generally, I notice that they say, I forgive you for the sake of Allah. I do this for the sake of Allah. That word, for the sake of Allah, that line is powerful. So for example, if I'm feeling hesitant to speak out when I know I need to speak out, and I think to myself, I need to speak out for the sake of Allah, it changes the dynamic. Now, the problem arises when we think that we have been endowed authority by Allah, and that we are God's police on earth. And then we start becoming God's police on earth. That's a problem. We should not be holier than thou. The first element of the equation is whenever we're trying to do islah in society is first implement on ourselves to make ourselves better, and then try to bring other people along within a courteous manner. What you notice, and I'll bring this to your attention, is as I mentioned to you a few nights ago, religion in America is very different, depending on where you are. The Northeast is very different than the Midwest. The Midwest is very different than the South. And the West Coast is very different than the rest. For example, if you go to, as I mentioned, if you go from Virginia to Texas, that's the Bible Belt. It's much more religious. Midwest is less religious, but still more religious than the East Coast. West Coast is the least religious. Why? Because when was predominantly the West Coast established? The West Coast was established when in 1849, there was a gold rush. We've heard of a team called the 49ers. And there was a movement westward searching for gold. In 1849. And so people came forward, and many of those people, sociologists who left the East to go towards the West, or left the South to go towards the West, they were people who were pioneers, cowboys, people who tradition and part of tradition, religion was not the most important thing for them. So you'll notice that, I'll give you an example. There was a shoe company, and you can check this out. It was a value-based shoe company called Atheist Shoes. It was a German company. And they sold out completely. They did amazingly well in Germany. And so the business decision came forward is, after Germany, where should we go next? And categorically, the answer that came to them, the next place that we should go is California, the west coast of the US, because it was the most aligned with those values. That's why many people you'll find in California are often, give me spirituality, but don't give me any religion. Why? Because religion, which we'll talk about tomorrow, people connote and think about it, and they think it's judgmental, it's negative, all of these attributes. Now, what happened in the history of Europe is that people threw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm giving you all these data points so you understand the worldview that your next generation is growing up in. Every environment has a drift. If I grow up, Steve Jobs did not come out of nowhere. He was born and raised in Silicon Valley. Every other person, his whole neighborhood, they were all of them were engineers. They all worked at Lockheed Martin. And in that environment, Silicon Valley was rising and entrepreneurship was rising. So it's not out of a vacuum that he came. If you grew up in Jamaica, you would have a very different worldview. You say you work too much. Take it easy. Take a break. If you grew up in another part of the world, you have a totally different view. So this is what we now call, in your companies teach you, called unconscious bias. Unconscious bias, those biases that we have, that we don't even realize that they're there. I'll give you another example. There's an excellent book which I highly recommend people read. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Dr. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, although he was a psychologist. And he says we make all of these blunders in our mind. One of his students wrote another book, which I highly recommend, which is called Predictably Irrational, Dan Ariely. Dan Ariely wrote, he said, we as humans, not only are we irrational, we're predictably irrational. He won the Nobel Prize because before him, we had an assumption in economics that human beings are rational actors. And he upended this notion. And he said that we're actually very irrational, whether you realize it or not. I'll give you one example. one example of irrationality in human beings is the substitution effect. The substitution effect is that if someone's running for office and someone wants to be a leader, a political leader, the question you should ask in your mind is this person qualified to be a leader? But that's a hard question. So without you realizing, the mind substitutes that question for an easier question. And that easier question is, does this person look like a leader? And the answer to that you substitute into the original question without realizing. So if the person is tall, there's a lot of data that taller people make a lot more money and they get promoted faster. And we don't even realize this. I'll give you another example. Daniel Kahneman's new book came out last year. I highly recommend you read that as well. It's called Noise. Noise, and this will help my youth for the next generation. If you're ever planning to go to Stanford or Harvard or Princeton or X, Y, and Z, or even a job interview at Amazon or Microsoft or Google, keep what I'm about to say in mind. Before you go, especially in Seattle, check the weather. Right? So noise. So they've done studies and they've looked at people going into admissions for top universities, and they looked at two candidates who are exactly the same on paper. Same grades, same extracurricular activities, same essay, same everything. The only difference was one thing, which we'll notice in a moment. So these, maybe the names were changed at the top, but besides that, everything was exactly the same. And so they sent this person in to go to the admissions interview. You know, there's the application process, then there's the interview. And over again, one of the candidates was accepted and one was rejected. They're exactly the same on paper. Even the answers that they prepped in the interview were exactly the same. What was the only difference? The only difference was the weather the person went for the interview. That when the person who got accepted went, it was sunny outside. And when the person who got rejected, it was raining outside. The person who got rejected, it was raining. The weather was having an impact on the decision maker, on the person who was giving admissions, giving the stamp. But if you ask the admissions counselor, they would never say that that's the reason. They didn't know. Unconscious, subconscious bias that people. So, more of the story, check the weather before you go to your interview. But what I'm trying to help you think is this is how much the environment impacts us without us realizing it. So if nobody wants to feel like a fish out of water, no one wants to feel like an alien. I'll give you an example. I grew up the first part of my life in the East Coast of America in DC. And then for some years we went to Dubai. Dubai, we lived there for a few years. Dubai before, it's not like Dubai now. Dubai, you could shelter your kids at the time. So our parents sheltered us. We got Islamic environment and we got some modernity. It was the best of East and West at the time when we were growing up there. And then now it's just ridiculous. So anyways, so at that time we were able to learn Qur'an and many things. And my parents wanted a better Islamic environment and they were able to provide that at that time. Now you can't do that. Shia community is curfewed and a lot of other challenges. Anyways, when I came back to America, I remember a particular moment. We were in the cafeteria. When we were in the cafeteria, this new song came that was on the radio, and everyone was asking, "Hey, did you hear that song?" And everyone was excited. And they turned to me and they said, "Yo, did you hear the song?" And I remember clearly as a young student, saying that no, I don't listen to music. And the after effect was that the whole entire cafeteria turned and said, "Who is this kid who doesn't listen to music? Well, not this. What planet did you come from?" And that's what I'm trying to invite. Peer pressure is very real. That is, if you feel like you're a fish out of water and you don't feel like you belong, you will do anything in your power to belong. Believe me, I've seen this in our communities. There are certain communities who they are so adamant about certain elements of azab, that if you try to say something out of it, you start adapting to that model. And then you start out of nowhere, you realize, there was a time when I was listening to Majalis in America, I actually despised other Muslims who are Ahlul Sunnah. I'm like, why on earth do I have this hatred for them? Why? Because for 20 years, the same person who was coming from India was spewing the same hate every single time. And I was absorbing that without realizing it. So what I'm trying to invite you to think about, how much of an impact does the environment have on your life? Similarly, in our world, it's much easier to say today that, for example, with respect to God and religion, you have to justify your belief as faithful. People have no problem with you saying I'm spiritual, but if you say I'm religious, there was an article in the New York Times that said there's a new curse word, a new swear word. It's called the R word. If you want to offend someone, call them religious. Because why? The connotation is religious people are judgmental. They are, this type of, down the list as we heard. So this is the reality of the matter. So we have an uphill battle. so to speak. So we need to say that with religion is supposed to be that element which inculcates the best traits and attributes. Inshallah, we'll continue that part of the conversation tomorrow. But I wanted to give these data points so people understand. There may be someone in the audience says, are you really talking about God at this time? But actually, that's the essence of why Imam Hussein rose. That's the essence of why all the prophets came. And if we're having trouble digesting that, then we really need to go back to basics. And I can tell you all the history of all the Imams and all what happened on the lead up to Karbala. But if that's not transforming the Muslim, that's why I believe the metrics, the KPIs, the OKRs, the measure by which we should judge our mosques, our centers, is transformation. Are people's lives transforming for the better? You know, we have net promoter scores at work. Have you heard of that? Like, how likely are you to recommend our product to someone else, for example? And that tells you everything you need to know. How likely are people to recommend your center, your mosque, your Husseini to someone else? How likely are people to move from another part of the world to come here because they want this for their kids, their future? This is the most important place to be. Or are we accidental centers, accidental communities just out of necessity? That's something that we need to come together and say, how are we going to measure the future of our community? Within that is the concept of Tawheed. Imam Hussein alayhi salam loved his family, he loved his loved ones, but he said Tawheed needs to be protected and preserved. So there. First element. Second element. When it comes to other religions, do you know the philosophical arguments? When the Christian community tries to explain God today, do you know what they rely on for the philosophical argument? They rely on the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of a creator. Kalam, coming from the Muslim world. Kalam was an era in Muslim history where there was theology and there was philosophy merged. So they were using philosophy to answer these questions. My dear young ones, my next generation, I've been telling you, one of the things that I've been highlighting, we need to work on the scholarship of our next generation. The people from the Mimbar must be people who are polymaths. They must be the most learned in society. They must know those things which are ranging from the Islamic literature all the way to biology, physics, chemistry, and down the line. Now you may say, how is that possible? I agree, it's difficult to do that. That means an alternative is you become those people. So you become professionals in the area of medicine and engineering and all those things that you're already doing, but then we have Islamic education on the side, so you're able to bring both together and discuss with the next generation epidemiology and for example, genetics and all the different things that the world is going to, AI and blockchain and all of the different technological revolutions that are happening and economics and all of these things so that you can talk to them on the same wavelength. That's something that we will be needing. There was an era in time from 800 to 1100 AD. The center of knowledge of the whole world was Baghdad. The whole world. It's called the Golden Age of Islam. That's where we got, for example, algebra, for example, Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabil by Muhammad al-Khawarizmi. In fact, our world runs on, what does Google run on? Google runs on an algorithm. Algorithm is a direct Latinization of Khawarizmi. I don't know how they did that, but that's what it is. And so even the x, why do we solve for x? Does anyone discuss this? 2x equals 6, divide both sides by 2, x equals 3. Where did the x come from? Why are we solving for x? Well, the reality is the first book on algebra known as Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabil was written in Arabic and it did not have equations like we do today. It had paragraphs. So it said 2 times a thing equals 6. What's the Arabic word for thing? Shay. 2 times a shay is equal to 6. So when it was being translated from Arabic to Greek, they said, we don't have the word shay in our language. How do we translate this to our language? They said the nearest thing that we have is chi. You know, chi squared, the chi Greek letter. So they turned shay into chi. So when these books were then translated from Arabic to Greek to Latin, they said, we don't have chi in Latin. How do we translate that? They took chi and they made it into x. That's the origin of the history of the letter x. So there were many things that came. In fact, in this era, you will find the first computer came out of this era. The first hardware-software interface. You can read a book by Stephen Johnson. He's talked about this in his books extensively. The first hardware-software interface came out of this era. It was a device that was called the device that plays itself. It played the flute and had cartridges. It was created by the Banu Musa brothers. It's called the first computer that we know of in history, in the modern era, in the modern time. But remember one thing, and I told you the first mental health hospitals came out of this era. Much progress came out of this era. In fact, there's one scholar by the name of Nasiruddin al-Tusi, Khwaja Nasiruddin al-Tusi, who was not only perhaps one of the greatest scientists of his time, he was also one of the greatest Shia Islamic scholars of his time. It was around the time when the Mongols invaded Baghdad. And without him, Copernicus's model of the universe is not complete, because you need something called the Tusi couple to complete Copernicus's model of the universe. Now, here's the kicker. Tusi was years, not that Tusi who you find in Najaf, right? That's a different Tusi. Tusi is a place. So this one, Copernicus's model is reliant on Tusi's couple. But here's the thing. If you put their diagrams next to each other, they're exactly the same. The only difference is that there are Latin letters in Copernicus's model and there's Arabic letters in the model of Tusi. But Tusi was hundreds of years before. So that means he was reading. This is what modern scholars are saying. But now here's the kicker. You and I, remember one thing. If you're looking in the rear view mirror, where are you not looking? You're not looking ahead. And we cannot say that we used to be great, we used to be amazing, we used to be X, Y, and Z. What about the future? The one who's looking in the rear view mirror all the time know that the decline has begun. They're not looking ahead. There's a book I invite you to read. It's called The Startup Nation. It's about startups and Israel, and why every major company in the world set up an incubator, a research incubator in that place. Why is it that a lot of them are Nobel laureates or a lot of, now you may give other reasons, perhaps. But what I'm inviting us to think, weren't we the ones who follow Babe Madinatul Ilm? Weren't we the ones who say that knowledge is, if all people in history, if they say nothing else about the Imam, they say they were the most learned scholars of their time. Even their enemies said this. So if you and I are followers of the Ahlul Bayt, at a bare minimum, we should stand for knowledge and justice at a bare minimum. By the way, I have to separate. When you are talking about knowledge in the time of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, knowledge included all of these things. It included justice. In fact, it included akhlaq. It included ethics. Today, we don't teach ethics formally. So when Plato was saying the person who should lead society is the philosopher king, that the world will not know justice until all kings become philosophers and all philosophers become king, in his mind was implicit that the person who is the greatest philosopher will be the most ethical, the most just, and the most humble in nature. All of these things were included. God. The Kalam argument that the Christian community relies on, many Muslims don't know, it came from this era. What is the Kalam argument? A very simple argument that actually holds weight philosophically. And it's two premises and a conclusion that follows from it. What is it? The argument is, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Simple, very elegant. Now, the difference is we call that cause Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Christian community calls it God. Now, for your young generation, this is where things may get a little bit difficult for you to fathom. You say, well, how do you know that that cause is separate from our existence? That is, was whatever caused this existence separate from this reality? Because Elon Musk and others say it's possible we're in a simulation. And other people come forward with this notion that maybe we're in a simulation. They say this because in the last 2 decades, just video games, the way that their graphics and things have improved, in just 2 decades, imagine down the line, you won't be able to tell the difference, especially with the metaverse and things coming. We need to be having these conversations with our next generation in order so that they understand Islam is timeless. The principles of good and ethics are timeless. It's just the modality and the applications may change based on the zaman and makan, and those things may change in those sense. Now coming to this is the philosophical argument. When it comes to this notion within science, is there any argument for the existence of God? And you may find that at some point, maybe you have to make a jump. But there are some things that you can tell your next generation and have a conversation with them about why do you believe in God? And when you hear from them, maybe you'll see where are the gaps. And maybe when they ask you the same question as a parent, for example, maybe they'll be able to identify some gaps in your view. There's a moment in time we're told that the 6th Imam, a man, by the way, atheists were not foreign at that time. There were many atheists during the times of the Imam. A man by the name of Abu Shakir. He was either an atheist or an agnostic. He comes to the 6th Imam. He says, Yabna Rasulillah, can you please tell me how is it that I'm supposed to prove the existence of God? Now remember, the Ahlul Bayt had a principle that kalima nas ala qadri uqulihim. They would talk to people based on their intellectual ability at that time. Now the Imam could not speak to somebody of that caliber and tell him about what we know today. He has to speak to him at that level. But there are examples where Imam answered a child, same question, a child very simply, and a philosopher with more advanced answers. So at that point in time, there was a child who was walking by and the Imam sees this child. He says, may I please have what's in your hand? The child gives it to the Imam. Imam looks at it like this. He says, oh, Abu Shakir, what if I told you there was a fortress? And inside this fortress was a thin layer. And inside that thin layer was molten silver. And inside that molten silver was molten gold. And what if I told you, Abu Shakir, that the molten silver does not mix with the molten gold, and the molten gold does not mix with the molten silver, and nothing has come into this and nothing has gone out of it? And Abu Shakir, what if I told you in some time, this fortress, out of it will emerge a creature, and eventually that same creature will not have much in the beginning, but eventually that same creature will have legs, and it will have wings, and it will have feathers, and it will have eyes, and it will have nose, and it will have this, and it will have that, and nothing designed it, and nothing went in and nothing came out? He said, this egg, which you and I call an egg, is exactly that. But you see it, and you just think of it as an egg. But really think abstractly about what this is. Now, keep this on ice for a moment. When you used to ask people in the old days, what's your proof of existence of God? They would tell you, for example, there was an old lady and she had a chakki, chakki like a mill, grounding mill. And she said that as long as I'm moving this grounding mill, it's moving. So somebody's running this universe. You ask a kid this day, it may satisfy some people, but today's kid would say it's overly simplistic. It's a little bit too simplistic. And so we need to be cognizant of this. Now, when it comes to this issue where the Imam is highlighting this complexity, there's a thought experiment by a philosopher by the name of Taylor. And he says, imagine you're walking and you see a globe. And this globe has light emitting from it. And it's just like this size, like a small ball. You would wonder, how did it get here? If you had no explanation, you'd wonder, how did this get here? Now let's say that globe becomes a little bigger. You'd still wonder the same thing. It gets a little bigger, and a little bigger, and a little bigger. What if that globe becomes the size of the universe? It's still that same globe. You would wonder, where did it come from? He said, similarly, we should think, we should not, just because the sun is so big and the universe is so big, and it's outside of our perspective, we see the sun every single day. That sun rising is a miracle. But when we see it every day, we just become habituated to it. We think that, it's just the sun. It's a miracle happening every single moment, but we become oblivious to it. So we need to reflect on this at every moment in time. Another moment in time, the eighth Imam was asked, "Ya Rasulullah, why are there so many different types of creatures that Allah has made?" And he's saying at that time, by the way, today we know you go to the Amazon and every day we're finding new species and new insects and new that we never knew existed again. In fact, we're even finding species that we thought were extinct and we find that they're not. There's so many creatures. By the way, we don't even know what's in the ocean. We have hardly any idea. Forget Mars. They said, Ya Rasulullah, why did Allah create so many different types of birds and so many this creatures and that creatures? Why so many? He says that so nobody can come on the day of judgment and say to Allah, Ya Allah, I created something that you did not think of. So Allah will say, I had this. Everything that we have in our world in some way, in some form, is inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. Everything that we've reverse engineered comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now comes the question of, from the scientific argument, what are some probabilistic arguments that you can make? And by the way, there are counters to this. I accept that for sure. But one is, for example, some say the theory or the second law of thermodynamics, for example. And this idea of the chaos or the entropy of the system is increasing. Now, you will find this throughout, for example, the universe expanding and this idea of entropy, chaos, or disorder increasing. That necessarily implies that originally there was some organization. We're going from a state of organization to disorganization, which implies that there was perhaps first something that put things in order and organized things. Otherwise, how do you go to a state of chaos? There are answers to this, sure. Another point, when it comes to this notion of something creating the universe or not, there's a brief history of time written by Stephen Hawking. And Stephen Hawking wrote it in passed away recently. In his chapter, he's talking about, well, what happened before and what led up to the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago when the Big Bang happened. By the way, one thing that I want you to remember is he's very cautious of this broad stroking narrative that all scientists are atheists. Do you know who came up with the Big Bang theory? Does anyone know what his name was? Sorry? Penrose. So he had some influence on it, definitely, but a lot of people don't know it, so let me just jump to it. His name was Lemaitre, although many other people contributed, no doubt. Lemaitre was a Belgian physicist, but he had another job. Does anyone know his other job? He was a priest. You can actually see him wearing his full priestly garb. He adamantly believed in God. The person who founded the Big Bang Theory was a believer in God, although today you would think the opposite. So what I'm saying is, you don't realize that many people who actually do believe in God. It's not necessarily that people are adamant and agnostics or atheists. So now coming to this, when he was writing the brief history of time, he said what led to this environment where God, for example, this came. He said what happened before the Big Bang is for philosophers to discuss. But if I can give you an analogy to understand, Stephen Hawking says, it would be like you put a bunch of monkeys into a room and you put a typewriter. Young people don't know what a typewriter is, right? So a keyboard or something into a room, and you have them beat away at the letters, and eventually they produce not words, not sentences, not paragraphs, but eventually they produce the sonnets of Shakespeare, 14-line masterpiece. So there was one individual by the name of Schroeder, who was another physicist, who came forward and said, hold on a second, is this the analogy you're giving? Let's test this. So he said the British Council of Arts has actually done a study on it. And when he studied and looked at it, he said they put a bunch of monkeys into a room and they checked how likely are they and what do they do. So they found that the first few days, they didn't even go near the typewriter. They put monkeys in a typewriter in a room. They didn't even go there for the first few days. Eventually, their words, not mine, they began to use the typewriter like a toilet. And eventually, they started tapping away. Eventually, after some long period of time, they eventually produced some content on the pages that were there on the typewriter. And when they got these pages of content, it was about 50 pages of content, of typing, gibberish, we call it. And so they were looking at what is the probability of words and things emerging. What is the shortest word in the English language? Anyone? A or I? A or I. But there's a necessary space before and space after, right? Then it becomes A or I. So he was looking in the content, and they found that in the 50 pages, there was not a single word. There was not a single A or I by itself. You could not find a single word. Then he said, now leave this to the side. Now we have to crunch the numbers on Shakespeare. He said, let me pick one of the sonnets of Shakespeare, 14-line masterpieces. He said, I'll pick the one that goes, shall I compare thee to a summer day? He took that one, and he said, okay, 488 characters. And he said each one is 26 letters in the alphabet, 26 raised to the 488th power. What are the numbers? So it came out to 10 to the 690th power. So I don't want to burden you with too many numbers of this power. Just imagine 0.0. If you do 1 over 10 raised to the 690th power, you get 0.0 followed by 690. The probability of that's very small. What is that the probability of? That's the probability of the sonnets of Shakespeare happening by accident. Now that's one side. The other thing is statistical zero. Statistical zero is a number that if it's smaller than this, statisticians say that it's just as good as zero. And that number is 1 over 10 to the 50th. If a number is smaller than that, statistical zero. Now I know there's a response to it, which I'll come to in a moment, but just to give you some perspective, since the Big Bang has happened 13.7 billion years ago, we've only had 10 to the 16 or 10 to the 17 seconds that have elapsed, all the way since the Big Bang. So to allow you to get your mind around how big that number is and 1 over it, how small that number is, it's unfathomable. He said, no scientist worth their weight will ever bet that this universe happened out of accident. It wouldn't happen. This is what Schroeder, the physicist's response was to Hawking. Although Hawking was not saying that I don't believe in God, he was just telling things as they are. And so at that point in time, you realize that if you want to make a probabilistic argument that this kind of happened out of nowhere, the error would be on the side of, you don't get order by accident. So there must have been something that was leading down the slide. This is what the argument that Schroeder made. So when he crunched these numbers, he realized that this probability is so small that the universe would come out of chance. He said no scientist would bet on it. Now, I know there's the multiverse argument. By the way, the multiverse argument is not against Islam in of itself. We could very well accept that Allah would create this multiverse. Very possible. But what I really want us to think is science changes. Remember, I remind you, and I told you this some days ago, 100 years ago, there were Quranic tafsirs of the Quran written. They wrote Quranic tafsirs based on the science of the time. And eventually the science changed. And then people are like, oh, what do we do now? So remember, the Quran is a book of guidance. What I'm saying is that person who is investigating the laws of Allah, the scientist is unlocking the keys of God's realm. So ultimately, this goes back to Allah. So, but now come to this. One thing that you're often not told in the media, and I'm drawing to a conclusion here, is this. Be very careful of what you're told in the media, and especially what you're not told. Based on one of the questions the young brothers asked us, right? How do you know what's truth, especially with this disinformation age? I've talked to many of my physician friends, and they tell me, for example, whenever the media, whenever there's one study that may show that alcohol is good in some way for the heart, it's all over the news. But they won't tell you, for example, you can drink the same amount of grape juice and perhaps it'll have the same benefits in the leaves of the grapes, for example. At the same time, they won't tell you the 1,000 other studies that are there that are going to tell you that it's really bad for you and has really, really bad adverse effects. So you need to be careful of that. The same way I told you, bad guys with guns solutions, good guys with guns, it's all marketing. It's not true. So we need to be very careful and cognizant. Another thing that I'm about to tell you right now, be careful of the narrative. When there's an atheist on the forefront, he's all over the news. But when there's someone who's a believer, they are very in the back. I'll give you an example. Remember a name, my young ones especially. The name is Antony Flew. Antony Flew was the biggest atheist of the last 100 years. He was the father, if you will, of the likes of Dawkins and other people. By the way, you may think Dawkins is very far from our community. Do you know that some of the biggest disciples of Dawkins are from Shia Sayyid backgrounds in Canada, Sadat backgrounds. And so they are big, adamant, big-time atheists. Inshallah, Allah will guide them and they'll come back. We shouldn't be like someone who's an atheist is someone who's negative. They're thinking at least. Many people may not think. Anyways, this is in our neck of the woods. Don't think we're very far from it. So anyways, Antony Flew, his whole life he's an atheist. Right before he's about to die, a couple of years before, he changes his mind. He says, I believe in God. The atheist community is in uproar. They won't tell you. The atheist community was like, what is wrong? We are atheists because of you, and now you're becoming a deist? You believe in God? So why? Said two reasons. Said one was the response of Schroeder to Hawking, the one I just told you. He said the other, and more importantly, is 3-letter. What is it? Dr. Flew? He said the 3 letters and one word is deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. The DNA? What do you mean DNA? He says DNA does not allow me, according to Flew, does not allow me to deny the existence of God. I said, why? He said the amount of information that is encoded in DNA that gives us our looks, our behaviors, all of these things. He says the adenine, guanine, cytosine, all of these things that you study that are embedded and encoded in DNA, that information is so much that I cannot accept that it happened by accident. For example, do you know how much data is? I won't give you big numbers right now, but just know this. With all the data flood that we've had in the last few years in the data science revolution, we still don't have that much data in our world today. We're projected to hit that number in the middle of this decade or at the end of this decade. That's how much data is encoded in each person's DNA. The argument essentially, in other words, he's saying is that information is encoded in human DNA. He says it's programmed in it. He says wherever you see that level of complexity, wherever you see that something has been programmed, no, there's a program, or someone programmed that. And so he said, for that reason, I cannot deny the existence of God. He wrote a book, which I invite you to read. It's called, you can read it's called There Is No God, and he crosses out the no, and he says, there is a God. And he said that I believe in God. So what I'm saying is the media may not tell you about these things, but there are many people who change their view. After being atheists for a long time, they said there is a God. Now, that may be for others, and we need to have this conversation in our community, but for you and I, perhaps the existence of Imam Hussein is enough to prove the existence of God. Imam Hussein, who in Dua Arafah beautifully expounds on what it means to have a relationship with Allah, where I invite you, just read one line a day of the Dua Arafah, where he says, and he goes into a complete anatomical detail of the whole body, where he's saying by the aorta and the matrices of the teeth and the jaw and the socket, and he even talks about the lining of the heart. He goes into explicit detail. As if, how did he see all of this? Because his father said, when he was asked, when Imam Ali, did you see God? He says, I don't believe in a God I did not see. Did you see him with your eyes? He said, no, I saw him with the eyes of my heart. That yaqeen, that certainty is what we're after. On the day of Ashura, we're told that on the way to Karbala, there was a conversation between Imam Hussein and his son that history captured. Before this, we're told during the time of the 6th Imam, Imam Sadiq, a man came to the 6th Imam and he says, Yabna Rasulillah, what is the greatest ornament of this life? What is the greatest zina of this life? What is the greatest blessing of this life? He says, if Allah gives someone a child and this child grows up in front of the parents' eyes, and that child becomes a cause of respect and admiration for the parents and society, that people look at this child and say, how good is this child? How good must the parents be? How good must the parents be that they raised a child like this? This would be the greatest ornament. He said, Yabna Rasulullah, what would be the greatest test of this life? He said, the greatest test of this life is if Allah took that same child back while the parents are alive. That would be the greatest test. There's a conversation between Imam Hussein and his son Ali al-Akbar. They say that with respect to this journey, there's a conversation ensuing, and at that point in time, Ali Akbar says, "My father, are we not on the truth? Are we not on the right path?" He says, "My dear son, we are definitely on the right path." Then Ali Akbar says, "My father, then what difference does it make? We fall upon death, or death falls upon us." Who knows what this means? Maybe scientists will find out in one generation or two the depths of what Ali Akbar was saying. At that point in time, the narrations say on the 10th of Muharram, Ali al-Akbar, he goes to his father to ask for permission to go to the battle. He says, "My father, do you give me the permission to go towards the battlefield?" At that point in time, the narrations say that Imam al-Hussein, it was a difficult heart that a father had to let his son go. He gave the permission to Ali al-Akbar. But he says, "Ali, go and ask permission from your mother first. Go and ask permission from your aunt first. She raised you." Ali Akbar goes towards the tent before the battlefield. When he goes towards the tents, at that moment in time, the narrations say that he was bidding farewell to all of the women and all of his sisters and all of the young ones. Tonight is the night, and these are the nights. It is the night, and please give the next few moments to Ali Muhammad. These are the nights of Muharram. These are the nights to commemorate what we've discussed. Perhaps it will have benefit or not, but these tears, the narrations say, will speak. Give the next few moments to Ahlul Bayt. The narrations say Ali al-Akbar was trying to leave the tent. When he was trying to leave the tent, at that point in time, every time he would try to leave, someone, it is as if they would pull him back. They would pull him back into the tent as if they were saying, "Ali, don't leave. Ali, whenever we wanted to see Rasulullah, we would look at your face because you resemble Rasulullah more than anyone." There is one narration that says that when Ali left for one other time, when he was leaving the tent, we don't know who grabbed him, but whoever grabbed him from beneath the knee. It seems that it was a young girl. Maybe it was a sister. She grabbed Ali Akbar. She said, "Ali, don't go." Eventually, Ali al-Akbar, he departs from his mother. He departs from his aunt Zainab, and he goes towards the battlefield. When he goes, at that point in time, he meets Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein gives the turban to Ali Akbar. He gives the shield to Ali Akbar. He gives the sword to Ali Akbar. He helps Ali Akbar on his horse. When Ali Akbar is about to proceed towards the battlefield, he is departing. He bids his farewell to his father, and then he goes towards the battlefield. When he goes towards the battlefield, the narrations say Ali Akbar hears footsteps behind him. When he hears these footsteps behind him, the narrations say Ali Akbar turns and he looks back. He says, "My father, Baba, you let me go. You bid me farewell. Why are you following me?" He says, Imam Hussein says, "Ali Akbar, Ali, my son, if you had a son like you would know what's going through my heart." He says, "Ali, go towards the battlefield. I give you in Allah's way." Ali Akbar proceeded. When Ali Akbar proceeded, Imam Hussein raises his hands towards the heavens. He says, "Allahumma shahadaha." He says, "Oh my Lord, bear witness that I am sending the one who in khalqan wa khulqan wa mantiqa, in the way he walked, the way he talked, and in every way he resembled your messenger Rasulullah. That whenever after Rasulullah we would want to do the ziyarah of Rasulullah, we would look towards Ali al-Akbar. That's the one that I'm sending. Ajrukum ala Allah." The narrations say Ali Akbar fought very courageously. He killed enemy after enemy, but they realized this was the son of Imam al-Hussein. When the enemy understood this, they said, "Surround him, ambush him," and they said, "Break the heart of Hussein." They all began to attack. When they all began to attack Ali Akbar, they struck him. Ali Akbar fell from his horse. The narrations say that typically when someone would fall, they would say, "Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah." They say Ali Akbar didn't say this. He says, "My father, alaykum minni akhiru salam." My father, my final salutations unto you. Why? Because he did not want Imam Hussein to have to respond to him, to have to come to his aid, because it would have become wajib. At that point in time, Ali Akbar falls towards the ground. When Ali Akbar falls towards the ground, narrations say Imam Imam al-Hussein ran towards him like a lion. This moment is captured by the poet Mir Anis. He tries to capture this moment between father and son, which I will try to do justice to. At that moment, Imam Hussein is running. And at that point in time, the poet says, Imam Hussein says, Beta pukaro phir ke basarat mein farq hai. Ay noor-e-ain jism ki taqat mein farq hai. Zakhmi qalb ruh ki rahat mein farq hai. Tum ye na janiyo ke mohabbat mein farq hai. Zakhme jigar mila. तुम्हें गोदी में पाल के किसको दिखाऊं अपना कलेजा निकाल के. And at that point in time, and he says that Ali Akbar responds and he says, Nagah sada ye aayi ke baba idhar hu main. Nagah sada ye aayi ke baba idhar hu main. Ay nakhle baag Fatima zere shajar hu main. Khaliq se lo lagi hai charag sahar hu main. Jald aayi hai ke aapka pyara pisar hu main. Zakhme jigar kahin ना अजल का बहाना हो. दीदार देख ले तो मुसाफिर रवाना हो. Imam Hussein comes to his son Ali al-Akbar. Do you know what the narrations say? Ajrukum Allah. The narrations say when Imam Hussein saw his son Ali Akbar, the grief overtook him. May Allah not show any father this day. Do you know what Imam Hussein did? The narrations say Imam Hussein took his cheek, the cheek which Rasulullah used to kiss, and he put it on the cheek of his son Ali al-Akbar, perhaps to feel some of the warmth from the face of his son Ali al-Akbar. There are two narrations. One narration says that Imam Hussein took his son himself. There's another narration that says Imam could not take him. He said, "Oh children of Banu Hashim, take yours, brother, for I cannot take him." Ajrukum on Allah, ajrukum on Allah. Give 2 minutes to Ali Muhammad, forgive me. And they say Imam Hussein took Ali al-Akbar, and at that moment in time, there was a scholar by the name of Zishan Had al-Jawadi. He says this situation is more difficult for the heart of Zainab. Why? Because Zainab raised Ali al-Akbar. There's a moment when Imam Hussein is bringing his son, and he's bringing him back to his tent. But how does he lift Ali Akbar? Ali Akbar is just as tall, if not taller, than Imam Hussein. He's his son. At that point in time, the poet says, La Shah hai barabar ka. These are Zainab's words. He says, La Shah hai barabar ka, bhaiya se na uthega. La Shah hai barabar ka, bhaiya se na uthega. Main palne wali hu, godi mein utha lu. So Zainab says that he is the same height as my brother. My brother won't be able to lift him. Give him to me, I'll lift him because I raised him. I raised him as my own child. Zainab, I don't know how she saw it. Ajrukum ala Allah. There was Layla in the tent who had raised her hand. She said, Ya. She said, Oh Allah, unite. You are the one who united Yusuf and Yaqub. Ya Radda Yusuf ila Yaqub. This was the dua, but one final moment. One final. Ajrukum ala Allah. May Sayyidah Zainab and Bibi Fatima be the witness of your tears. There's a moment in the Bazaar of Sham, they say. In the Bazaar of Sham, they say that all of the women, they were there and they were tied up. There were people who are from Sham. They were looking at the heads on the spears. They said these heads are the most beautiful heads that we've seen. These are those people who are like the moons. They said there was one moment where there was one lady who was from Sham. She was just staring at one head. And this one head, she was just focused on it. At that moment, they say, a lady came to her who was from the Ahlul Bayt. She said, "Oh lady, can I ask you a question?" She said, "What is this? Why are you staring at this head? Why are you staring at this face? Why are you focused so much over here?" She says that I am looking at this face. I don't know who this is, but I am looking. And to me, this is the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. This is the most beautiful person I've ever seen. I am just doing one dua. She said, "What's the dua?" I am just praying that whoever this young man is, that his mother was not alive to see this day. They say it was Layla who was the one standing. She said, "Oh lady, don't say that. That is my son Ali al-Akbar. I am his mother." I'm sorry.
We always say,
मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर। भाई बहनों का है अजब रिश्ता, जिसका सानी कहीं नहीं मिलता। वो के सुगरा ने ये लिखा अकबर, एक दुखिया लाज रख लेना। मर गया तू बताऊं मैं कैसे, मर गया तू बताऊं मैं कैसे। तेरा लाशा उठाऊं मैं कैसे अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर। बचपन जीने अब कहाँ अकबर, दिल से उठती है ये पुकार अकबर। सब आशूर दी थी तो तुमने बुलाए वो आजाद अकबर। तेरी सूरत बुलाऊं मैं कैसे, तेरी सूरत बुलाऊं मैं कैसे। तेरा लाशा उठाऊं मैं कैसे अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर। सबसे गम का वो हाल है बेटा, देखो कैसे ये जख्म सीने का। मैं तो परदेश में अकेला हूँ, देख कर जाऊं क्या करूं बेटा। पे मरहम लगाऊं मैं कैसे, पे मरहम लगाऊं मैं कैसे। तेरा लाशा उठाऊं मैं कैसे अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर। गुर्बत में मुँह नहीं मोड़ो, मैं हूँ तन्हा मुझे न यूं छोड़ो। क्या गुजरती है बाप के दिल पर, हमदला दिल को यूं नहीं तोड़ो। अपनी गुर्बत बताऊं मैं कैसे, अपनी गुर्बत बताऊं मैं कैसे। तेरा लाशा उठाऊं मैं कैसे अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर। तू है घड़ियल जवान बेटा, बाप तेरा गरीब है कितना। मुड़ा खो हो गया रुखसत, मुझको आता नहीं नजर खैमा। लेके खैमों में जाऊं मैं कैसे, लेके खैमों में जाऊं मैं कैसे। तेरा लाशा उठाऊं मैं कैसे अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर अकबर, मेरा सहर हवाला अकबर। I'll sing, 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 अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी 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 अकबर तू ना आयो मैं सदफे में बारी अकबर तू ना आयो मैं सामन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो जीड़ा बेड़ा दा बाज बेहावाजे जीड़ा बेड़ा दा बाज बेहावाजे तेरी भूल गई भेड़ बिहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो वीर गढ़ा बनाया वीरा बालड़िया वीर गढ़ा बनाया वीरा बालड़िया माधर सतारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मर्द कलेजे होया बेच मदीने से मर्द कलेजे होया बेच मदीने से जालिम हरची मारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो बाबा दे बिच वेखा डोरी झूले तेरी बाबा दे बिच वेखा डोरी झूले थी तेरा झूला रह गया खाली अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो नाने दे रोजे दे जाके रात देंगे नाने दे रोजे दे जाके रात देंगे मैं रोहलत गुजारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मीरा वाली माया पीर कटा दिया रे मीरा वाली माया पीर कटा दिया रे किस्मत दी मारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो जीड़ा बेड़ा दा बाज बेहावाजे जीड़ा बेड़ा दा बाज बेहावाजे तेरी भूल गई भेड़ बिहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मैं सदके में भारी अकबर तू ना आयो मैं सदके में भारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो मनता मन मनहारी अकबर तू ना आयो
Hussein, 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 Ali Mala, Ali Mala, Ali Mala, Ali Mala, Ali Mala. Ali Mala, 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 Ali Mala. میگوید حسین با میگوید حسین حسین تو دوام ما میگوید حسین با میگوید حسین ما میگوید حسین با میگوید حسین آیه آیه حضرت الله میگوید حسین آیه آیه حضرت الله میگوید حسین ما میگوید حسین ما میگوید حسین ما میگوید حسین ما میگوید حسین آیه آیه حضرت الله میگوید حسین آیه آیه حضرت الله میگوید حسین یار میگوید حسین دلدار میگوید حسین یار میگوید حسین دلدار میگوید حسین فاطمه بر مرتضی مخار میگوید حسین فاطمه مرتضی مخار میگوید حسین داد میگوید حسین یاد میگوید حسین داد میگوید حسین یاد میگوید حسین در میاد سجده اش سجاد میگوید حسین در میاد سجده اش سجاد میگوید حسین درود میگوید حسین درود میگوید حسین درود میگوید حسین درود میگوید حسین دختری در شعله و دود حسین دختری شده با دود میگوید حسین داد میگوید حسین داد میگوید حسین داد میگوید حسین داد میگوید حسین خسته در خون قاسم داماد میگوید حسین خسته در خون قاسم داماد میگوید حسین یاس میگوید حسین ساس میگوید حسین یاس میگوید حسین ساس میگوید حسین در کنار علقم باس میگوید حسین در کنار علقم باس میگوید حسین عشق میگوید حسین عشق میگوید حسین عشق میگوید حسین عشق میگوید حسین نهر علقم با دو چشم عشق میگوید حسین نهر علقم با دو چشم عشق میگوید حسین تیر میگوید حسین شیر میگوید حسین تیر میگوید حسین شیر میگوید حسین بین خیل اصفر شیر میگوید حسین بین خیل اصفر شیر میگوید حسین یار میگوید حسین دلدار میگوید حسین یار میگوید حسین دلدار میگوید حسین فاطمه مرتضی مخارمی فاطمه مرتضی مخارمی ماه میگوید آه میگوید ماه میگوید ماه میگوید آیه حضرت الله میگوید آیه حضرت الله میگوید حسین
Hussein, Hussein,
حسین
Hussein,
حسین
Hussein,
حسین
Hussein,
حسین
Hussein,
حسین
Hussein,
حسین
Hussein,
حسین حسین
وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على محمد.
سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله اللهم صل وسلم. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين وإمام المتقين يا الصلاة يا الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.